My name is Greg Dunlap, and I work at Lullabot. I was the lead of the content strategy team for the creation of GovHub. And since then, I've gone on to do a lot of other major state government projects for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and currently for the state of Iowa. And a huge part of my work is designing systems that help people create content that works well with the modern web. And that's what we're here to talk about today. But first, I want to take a moment to look back at the history of content on the web, because understanding that history can help inform how we work and provide some context around why creating content today seems so challenging. And I've kind of divided this into three broad phases. The first one is files. In the beginning, every page on the web was a single file sitting on a server somewhere. If you wanted a new page, you made a new file. Files had to be retrieved from the server they were on, edited, and put back. And if there was something you wanted on every page, it had to be in every file. And if it changed, you changed every file. And hopefully you weren't working on the same file at the same time as someone else, because at the end of it, someone was going to be really unhappy. This is how I built my very first websites in the early 90s, and it was exhausting. And during this time, web content was mostly owned by programmers or system administrators, people with specialized knowledge of how the internet and web servers worked, because they were the only ones who understood how to make these changes. And if your content needed to be changed, you had to contact them and they would change it for you, because the tools needed to change this content were very complex. However, the content itself during this time was very simple, and people didn't really think about it very much. You put some words on a web page and you called it a day. And often the people running the websites were even writing the copy themselves. The tools required very specialized knowledge, but the content was really straightforward. Now, in phase two, we kind of see the beginnings of content management. And as organizations begin realizing the strategic importance of the web, marketing and executive stakeholders wanted more and more control over this content, but they lacked the skills or knowledge to use the tools that were available to them. So people started to create content management systems to bridge this gap. And the earliest ones like this were little more than an interface to write HTML into a very simple form. This is actually a screenshot of the first content management system I ever built for a small church in Tennessee when I was a freelancer in the early 2000s. The important thing here is that these new tools enabled content people to have access to the website without specialized knowledge. System administrators no longer held the keys to the website. It also allowed a level of reuse. If you wanted a block of text in the footer of every page, you could do it once and insert it in many places. You also got a visual editor that would give you an idea of how your content would look when it was completed. It seems really simple now, but at the time it was a massive step forward. And this was the beginning of a switch, which continues today, which is that the tools were on their way to being more approachable and less specialized, but the content itself was becoming less approachable and more specialized. More planning was needed to create content that worked well throughout larger organizations. And since the content was more critical to their success, it required more care and it had more eyes on it. That brings us to phase three, which began about 15 years ago, around the time of the launch of the iPhone. And two critical things have happened during this phase. The first is that content management systems have matured immensely to the point where they are, despite what some of you may say, highly usable without specialized training. However, at the same time, the web has changed immensely in ways that have caused the content itself to become much more complicated and intricate. We cannot anymore write pages of content and just call it a day. Technology like mobile devices have changed how we interact with the web. Enabling users with assistive devices has become a priority. SEO and social media have changed the way that people interact with their content. We've been hearing today about how AI agents are reading our content and using it in their language models, and all users expect a higher level of quality across the board. And here are some of the things we need to worry about on a regular basis that we never did in the past. Your content has to be consistent. If you see a location or an event or a press release, it should be immediately recognizable as that across all of your websites, because consistency breeds public comfort and trust in the information that they're reading, and it reduces the mental effort to figure out what people are looking at. Well-designed content is also reusable. If you create a piece of content for every location or office your agency operates, you should be able to use those locations in different contexts without needing to re-enter that content over and over. Right now on GovHub, every site has a primary contact, for instance, and this contact can be used in your agency's detail page or in the footer or in your About Us page. You can embed it in a WYSIWYG. You can place it in a block on a landing page. You can share it to your georgia.gov org page, and you can include it on services that are associated with your org. And for all of these placements, if a phone number changes or an address changes, you update it in one place. Content is often inherently connected to other content. Blog posts have authors, events have locations, government agencies have services they provide. Making these connections explicit in the system creates links that empower users and also improve the experience for site authors by, again, preventing duplicated data and from information being updated over and over. And I know that it feels more complicated to do this when you're initially entering content, but it saves you so much time in the long run. Content is not doing any good if people can't find it. Findability means the content is available using the terms of the user in the place they most expect it. And this is more than just keywords in SEO. It's also about site organization and navigation, as well as ensuring that when results are presented to a user, they get enough context to know this is the information they need. In this first result here from an agency for the state of Iowa, who I'm currently working with, you can see that there's no description or information available for the page that's the first hit. And in the other two results, the description is truncated. This is the result of the page content not specifying its metadata properly. And these are all the kinds of issues that are part of findability. It also needs to be filterable. This is like a subset of Findable. Sometimes you don't know exactly what you're looking for, and you're in more of a research mode than getting to a specific task. And in those cases, being able to sort and filter groups of content is very valuable. You can see here that we can search for tax forms on the Department of Revenue website, not just based on keywords, but also on the topic that the form applies to. This type of interface is great when you have a lot of content that users need to dive into. Your content needs to be responsive. Over 60% of the state's visitors to websites right now access them from a mobile device. And as such, it's vital that this content should work and be fully reusable at all screen sizes. This is especially important for government work, where many constituents have no way to access the content other than through their phones or another mobile device. And finally, your content needs to be accessible using assistive devices for constituents who can't use the web using traditional browsers or who are from a variety of educational backgrounds or cultures. And again, this is especially important in government work because these constituents tend to also be the most vulnerable and in need of government assistance. So here's the pattern. As our tools have become more simple, our content needs have become far more complex. And when we talk about transforming your content strategy and your approach to your content, I think it's really important to keep this in mind because I'm guessing a lot of you struggle with creating high quality web content, and that's not a surprise. Providing high quality web content is really complicated. And the thing is, it's not that GovHub or your tools are complicated, it's that content in the modern world is just complicated. Modern web is complex, and understanding that is really key to moving forward with transforming your content strategy. So what can we do? I think a lot of us think of content as pages of words that we create by typing or pasting into an editor on the website, and it's just not true anymore. As Will mentioned in his last session, the words on the page need support and context in order to communicate their meaning in the myriad ways that your residents require. At the end of the day, content is not words, it's data. Here's an example. There's a blog post from the digital services team, and you can see all of the usual blog post stuff you would expect there. It's pretty straightforward. Now, I'm sure many of you have encountered this field called summary when you're writing your own content into your own websites. And the field is used to briefly summarize what's on the page so that users can know if this is something they're interested in when they see references to the post in other contexts. This works by setting something in the page called the meta description. The meta description exists in the page's HTML, but it's never actually displayed on the page itself for end users. It allows other websites or contexts to read information about the page and use it to create previews. Some of these contexts are social media previews on sites like Twitter or Facebook, or previews in Google, like we saw earlier in the presentation, or even on listing pages within GovHub itself. Lots of people will just paste the first paragraph of their first page content into the summary field, but they're really doing their content a disservice because a good meta description summarizes the page content or serves to draw people in and encourage them to visit. And the content on the page early on rarely serves that purpose. For instance, here you can see that there's a call to action in the preview. How do you set up your online forums for success? Find out in our new web forms guide. We call information like this metadata, which is information that's about the page, but not part of the page itself when it's displayed. And this is just one example of how creating well-supported web content is more than just about the words that you put into the body. You also need to think beyond the page. Most of the time when you're in your sites, you're probably adding or editing pages of information about a specific topic, and that's great and necessary work. But in order to achieve the goals we laid out earlier in the presentation, you need to think beyond just the page you're creating and think about how it fits in with the other pages of your site and the greater goals of your organization. An example of this is properly using taxonomies. Taxonomy is just a fancy word for how you arrange or organize things. For instance, in a bookstore, the labels of fiction, nonfiction, biography, etc., are a taxonomy that help people find what they're looking for. GovHub has a lot of taxonomies which can be used to arrange your content, and they're great, but in order to use them, you need to understand all of the content that you have in order to create the descriptors that are appropriate for it. And then when adding the content itself, you need to understand how that content fits in relation to other pages in order to apply them properly. For instance, if you create a new document in GovHub, you have access to 4 taxonomies: type, category, service, and division. And these identify different properties of your document. Type, what is it? Is it a form? Is it meeting minutes? Is it an annual report? Category, what is it about? Taxes, child welfare, adult education. Services, what services your agency provides does this apply to? Is it for driver's license? Is it for food aid? Is it for other kinds of licensing? Division and section, what part of your organization does it apply to? Now, that's a lot of ways to identify a PDF, and a lot of people have at various points probably said, I just want to upload this and be done with it. But the problem is that when you do that, you lose access to a lot of the power that's at hand in your systems. Earlier in the presentation, we saw this search interface for forms on the Department of Revenue site. Taxonomy is what makes this page possible. This page allows users to search documents only that have a type of form and then filter them by the categories which are listed along the right-hand side. If you don't taxonomize your content properly, then this kind of functionality is not available for your end users. And taxonomy isn't possible if you don't think beyond the page and approach your site's content from a bigger picture, more holistic view. And that leads us to our last tip, which is hire content professionals. Much of the content on George's agency's websites is managed by subject matter experts. And this is great from one perspective because they all know their topic areas, many of which are quite complicated and intricate. And their input into this content is absolutely essential. The problem is that modern content for the web is also complicated. And in order to do it justice, you need a different set of skills. You need to understand the technical impacts of creating content in different ways, how it'll be read by search engines, how to write it for your audience, how it interconnects with other content on your site to make a whole. And subject matter experts shouldn't need to know how to do all that. It's literally not their job. And yet here they are having to do it anyways. And it's not really fair to anyone. And when our clients ask me what change they can make, which will have the most impact on their content, this is what I tell them. You should hire content professionals to manage your content. Let the subject matter experts provide information, but let the content people make it work for the web. If content is truly a priority for your organization, then you should treat it that way. And I know this isn't an easy change. It involves changing roles and workflows and priorities. Here's an example of how this might look. In this workflow, you have a subject matter expert who generates an idea for content, writes an initial draft, and reviews it with whatever other stakeholders they might need to review it with, their manager, their legal team, etc. At that point, they put it into their system and hand it over to a content person. That person reviews and revises this content against the internal style guide for the agency and other web standards, and starts to think about how it's going to get organized into the site. After they make their changes, they pass it back on to the subject matter experts to review and revise for accuracy, and they pass it on to other stakeholders for revision. And this process goes on until everybody feels the content is in a good place. And then the subject matter experts are done. And the content professional can now take this content, finalize it, taxonomize it, get its metadata set up, and publish it in a way that takes advantage of all of the specialized knowledge and specialized complexity that the modern web requires. And it sounds like a lot of work to make this change. And in some ways, you're completely changing the way your organization approaches and works within your site. And you're right, you are, and it is a lot of work. But at the end of the day, though, doing that work is the only way to truly transform your content strategy, because content strategy requires organizational change and an organizational commitment to prioritize content for your constituents. Truly, without rethinking what content means to your org, you truly understanding who your users are and developing content for their needs, then everything else is kind of just a band-aid. And that's why this all seems so hard, because trying to do this work without the organizational change is very difficult to maintain over time. Someone from digital services might come in and help you and get you set up to a good place, but you need people within your organization or who you have access to on a regular basis to keep that momentum going over time. That's my presentation, and I would be happy to answer any questions anybody has.
Wonderful. Thank you, Greg. There is one question. What do you think? I'm at a small organization and staffing can be difficult. Are there any third-party content management or content strategy services? And is that a good way to manage our content?
I think it can be. Depending on the needs of your organization, you might want to talk to somebody who is, there are many, many people in the content strategy world, especially now, who are freelancers or independent. And many of them are looking for work because tech layoffs have been really bad this year and content people have been particularly hard hit by them. So establishing a relationship with a freelancer in your area might be a really good way to get started along that path, and somebody who can help guide you towards a way to improving your processes. I know that the people at digital services, of course, also have content people that are available to help you work. And if they're booked up or you need a longer term commitment, they can probably help you find the help that you need or the people that you could to get in place. The other nice thing about obviously working with freelancers or contractors is it's less of a commitment, and you can, try people out without necessarily hiring them and find somebody who's a good fit for your organization, and within a limited amount of time for an initial engagement.
Thank you for that response, Greg. There are no additional questions.